Welcome. Before we jump in, I should mention this is a spoiler review. If you haven't seen the film yet and want to, I would recommend clicking off this video and watching it for yourself. If you have seen the film already, or just don't really care, let's move on, shall we? Written and directed by Lee Cronin, The Mummy is a horror film which actually doesn't have much to do with the previous Mummy films you might be aware of. It follows Charlie Cannon and the rest of his family. While living in Cairo, their daughter Katie goes missing. It isn't until 8 years later when Katie is found. But something's not quite right about her. Alright, immediately I wanted to start with something a little bit different, and it's something I kind of wish I started doing beforehand, like when I started doing these smaller reviews, and that's record a little something before I actually go see the movie, so then that way you can directly see like a clash of how I feel going into it than I do coming out of it. So, I should probably mention, Lee Cronin is a director that I was not very familiar with. And personally, I think that's going to be the case for a lot of people, because his most popular film is 1000% Evil Dead Rise, which I actually just watched for the first time last night, at the time of recording. And I'll be honest, it might be my least favorite in the Evil Dead series. Not that it's bad, it's just that series, I really love, like, the Sam Raimi stuff, specifically. But yeah, that's not the point of this. But yeah, going into the movie, I'm very curious, because all the trailers, they looked interesting. And yes, it does look like they're trying to go almost more for, like, an Exorcist vibe, rather than a Mummy vibe, especially with, like, how in The Exorcist Believer, the two girls were gone for 3 days, and in this case it seems to be 8 years, if the trailers are to be believed. But yeah, I was gonna say, like, some of the stuff shown in the trailers, it looks very gory. It looks like a really interesting take. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about this almost being like a possession thing, it looks like. I'm sure I'll have stronger feelings on it after I come out of the movie. Yeah, so I'm gonna go see it in give or take an hour from recording this. And yeah, obviously what you're about to hear next is me after I came out of the theater and wrote a script. So yeah. So I was right about having stronger feelings about the whole possession thing coming out of the film. I'm gonna be honest, this film's title being The Mummy just seems like needless branding. I know that technically the full title is Lee Cronin's The Mummy, but we all know what you're doing. Immediately when I came out of the theater, I had this thought of, oh, is this what Wolfman fans felt after having seen Leigh Whannell's version? Because that's precisely how I felt about this one. Now, I've made it no secret that I actually really like Leigh Whannell's version of Wolfman. In fact, I have it in the 6th spot out of 50 in my 2025 ranking. But I also kind of understood why people didn't care nearly as much about the film, and I do agree that it probably would have helped with expectations if they just called it Hill's Fever or something like that. I feel like that's what should have happened here. Because the titular mummy in this film isn't really a mummy. Now, I will say the reveal of her toenail coming off and ripping off her skin, and later it's revealed it's actually several layers of bandages, was very good. But I feel like with a mummy film, that's not exactly what people would think of when it comes to mummies. I'm assuming we've seen pictures of mummified people. If you wanted to go for an unwrapped mummy look, why didn't you just do that? I also know this comparison was being made even before the film came out. And yeah, you can tell this was the same guy who did Evil Dead Rise, because large chunks of this film felt like Evil Dead without the charm or campiness. The way the other characters talk when they're being possessed was basically just how the Deadites spoke. I also think the Exorcist comparisons I made before going into it were also kind of valid. While still somewhat tame compared to some stuff in the original Exorcist, of course there's still the whole thing about a girl being possessed, causing havoc around the house and to other people, and even some of the stuff they say was also reminiscent of how Pazuzu spoke. But again, this is a mummy movie. Now, I will give the film this. I would rather watch it over the Tom Cruise one. But is that really a compliment? There's not a lot about this film that needs to be about a mummy specifically, and if it was just renamed to something else, I think the film would, again, be a little more well-received, because I imagine a lot of people completely disregarded Lee Cronin's name in the title and thought it was related to the Brendan Fraser one. Honestly, I think that's where most of my gripes come from for this film. I've made it no secret that I love the Universal Classic Monsters on this channel. Hell, it's my most viewed video, for some reason. Even with the fact I, and many others, think the original Mummy movie from 1932 is still just an inferior version of the 1931 Dracula, I do still think it's a good film. Solid 7.5 out of 10 from me. Hell, even the Brendan Fraser one I like fine enough, but would probably rather watch Indiana Jones if I'm in that kind of mood. This one is so radically different from any previous incarnation, I can understand why people feel a little cheated, especially if it's just a repackaged Evil Dead movie. What's funny is they played a trailer for the next Evil Dead movie, Evil Dead Burn, and I gotta be honest, that looked way more entertaining than this film did. Plus, it has the luxury of actually being an Evil Dead film. But I'll stop harping on the title and move on to other things about the film. Well, I'll start off with its length. I'm a bit of a stickler for length on horror films. Now, it's not because of any "I just have a short attention span" arguments, because I fucking hate that shit. I'm of the opinion that if your horror movie is over 2 hours, you better know what you're doing, because the worst kind of horror film, in my opinion, is a boring one. I already don't like boring movies, but there is a reason a lot of people see horror as basically a print money button. Why do you think there's 12 Friday the 13th films, 13 Halloween films, 9 Nightmare on Elm Street films, and so on and so forth? People go to horror films to get scared. If a horror film is boring, that tells me you failed at your job twice. Not only making a good movie, but also making a scary movie. This film did not need to be 2 hours and 14 minutes. I don't think most horror movies can survive that runtime, because you eventually get desensitized to the horror, unless it finds a way to keep building it up and keeping it interesting. The Shining is nearly 2.5 hours, but it places its scares in all the right places, builds a tense atmosphere, and knows how to keep building up the climax more and more throughout the film. This film probably could have been an hour 40 minutes, and not much would have changed. Even then, one of the reasons I didn't care all that much about Evil Dead Rise was because even with its 1 hour 36 minute runtime, the pacing was still a little all over the place for me. So I see now that when given an extra almost 40 minutes, yeah, those results are not going to be much better. This was another problem I had, although very minor and borders more on being a nitpick. Oh my god, please take the split diopter lens away from this guy. Look, sometimes I love me a split diopter shot. Who doesn't? But in my opinion, it's best used in moderation. Even Brian De Palma knew that, and he was obsessed with the fucking thing. The final thing I'll mention for negatives is the ending. Because a part of me feels it kind of defeats the purpose of the film. I get that it's supposed to be the kidnapper getting her comeuppance, but didn't that kind of already happen when she got sent here in the first place? Possessing her on top of that just seems unnecessary unless you wanted to make sure Charlie wasn't possessed anymore either. But then his sacrifice would have meant nothing and was only a temporary roadblock instead of finally giving him closure on being able to help his daughter when she needed it. This entire ending seems tacked on to me, and it feels like an ending the studio would have suggested or something they would have done after poor test screenings. Because if it ended with Katie and Charlie communicating with each other with Morse code through the sarcophagus, I think that would have been a fine enough ending. I'll get into basically the one positive thing I have. It's the gore. There were many moments where I just sat there like, ew, oh my god. Especially the bit with her mom cutting her toenails. I could see them shifting around already, so that was already gross, but then when the skin actually came off, even some of the other stuff, like when the youngest daughter started pulling out all her teeth and the grandma being eaten, were pretty good effects. But they are mostly there just to be there and are more of a break from the monotony than actually there to tell you how fucked the situation is. Some of the cinematography I did also like, but again, the constant use of a split diopter lens was getting extremely distracting. I think the film was pretty mid, and there's not exactly much here to lose your mind over. Honestly, most of the trailers for the film are better than the film itself. Just watch those. They're basically highlight reels for the best parts anyway. I'll give Lee Cronin's The Mummy a 5 out of 10. I thank you so much for watching, and remember, come back anytime!